my mind is sort of going back and comparing with previous impressions of this flavor, I can't quite get it. What is it? Honey bush. So now I have an impression of honey bush, so if I get that tea on a later occasion, I'll be able to compare. And then if something is dangerous, then there'll be like still later stages of mental processing where, okay, say a dog is running after me, barking, then I compare with previous impressions of dogs that have run after me barking. Some, when they get up to me, wag their tail and start, sniffing in a friendly way. Others have bitten me.
How early can a yoniso manasikara happen? That this is a cup, it's beautiful, but it's not mine. So I have greed. So how early can it happen?
It would actually probably, that kind of a yoniso manasikara, which leads to greed, would come in mind consciousness at a fairly, I would say, a somewhat later stage. But I think the Abhidhammika teachers would say that the ayoniso, this is the unwise attention, comes in at an early stage. They would say that, though it seems to me, since I think more at the level of practical orientation rather than this fine theoretical analysis. But we could see how maybe if we pay close attention to the working of our mind, that even that unwise attention slips in almost unconsciously at a very early stage. Like when I see maybe that the neighbor has a new car that I don't have, I'm just driving a Toyota and he pulls in a Mercedes or Jaguar. Or I'm using a Dell computer and the person sitting next to me, I see they pull their computer out of their computer sack and it's a Macintosh with all of the latest fancy programs. That's not a hint because I can't use a Macintosh. Any other questions so far at this point? Shall we go on then to the next? Okay, so then the Buddha says, when he knows and sees these 18 elements, a monk can be called skilled in the elements. Okay, now since the Buddha already sort of mentioned a number of ways in which a monk can be called a wise man, an inquirer, the Buddha now picks up, Ananda picks up, we're still in relation to the elements. So Ananda then asks, could there be another way in which a bhikkhu can be called skilled in the elements? And so now the Buddha says that there is, and then he says that there are 6 elements. Here we have the earth element, the water element, the fire element, the air element, the space element, and the consciousness element. When he knows and sees these 6 elements, a monk can be called skilled in the elements. Okay, this is a very concise explanation of the 6 elements, but we can find a more detailed analysis of at least the first 5 elements if we turn back to Sutta number 62. This would be on page 528. Okay, here the Buddha is speaking to his son, his biological son, Rahula, who's probably at this stage an adolescent, maybe 17, 18 years old. And he's explaining to him how to meditate on the elements. And so he explains now the earth element, whatever, in this on 528, paragraph 8, whatever internally belonging to oneself is solid, solidified, and clung to. And then he mentions, I think it's 19 or 20 components of the body, which are considered solid, hard and solid. Hairs of the head, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinews, bones, and the various organs, the kidneys, heart, lungs, spleen, intestines, and so on. So this is taken as representative of the earth element. Then we have the water element. What is the water element? Whatever is so that's the internal water element. And then the external element would be any kind of external objects that are solid, hard, and so on. Okay, what is the water element? The water element might be internal or external. The internal water element is whatever internally belonging to oneself is watery or liquid and clung to. So then he mentions the number, I think there are 12 liquid parts of the body: bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, and so on, down to the oil of the joints and urine. And then there's the external water element, any kind of external liquid. The fire element, or heat element, okay, is again internal or external. What is the internal fire element? Whatever internally belonging to oneself is fiery and clung to. And then I think 6 aspects, or is it 4 aspects of the fire element are mentioned. That by which one is warmed, so that's the bodily heat, normally around 98 degrees Fahrenheit. That by which one ages and is consumed. This was the Indian physiological belief that heat causes the body to grow old. Maybe an example of this outwardly is that if you have a fruit, an apple or banana, well, bananas we don't refrigerate, apple or pear, and we keep it outside, or better, mango, okay, an apple or a mango, we keep it outside where it gets exposed to the heat, then it starts to wither, to dry up, and to go bad. But if we refrigerate the apples and the mangoes and the papayas and the grapes, then they will be preserved for a long time. So the heat element is what's causing them to deteriorate, to age. And then that by which what one eats, drinks, consumes, gets digested. That is, the digestion, what actually causes the agent of digestion is the hydrochloride in the stomach acid, and that digests the food, it burns up the food. In fact, burning up the food, it's a process of digesting the food, of oxidation. And oxidation is exactly the same as consumption by heat. So that's the internal fire element, and then there's the external fire element. Not only burning fires, but the heat present in the atmosphere, the heat coming from the sun, any kind of heat in external objects. And then there's the air element or wind element. And the internal air element, the Buddha says, is whatever internally belonging to oneself is air, airy, and clung to. That is upgoing winds, downgoing winds. So these are the winds that go through the body. And in the ancient Indian physiology, it seems that what we would now call nerve impulses, neurological impulses, were interpreted as the movement of the air element through the body. So we have upgoing winds. Those might be interpreted as the distinction is made between motor neurological impulses, those which are responsible for movement, and then sensory neurological impulses, those responsible for sensations. And then there are winds or air in the belly, as we know when we belch, winds in the bowels, of course, which we know when we fart. And then the winds that course through the limbs. And then the most obvious would be in-breathing and out-breathing. And then externally, there's the movement, there's the air, and its movement is seen most distinctly in the wind. Okay, this is a sort of, we call this a detailed and very concrete way of explaining the four material elements. But according to the Buddhist philosophical analysis, the four elements are actually somewhat metaphorical terms which represent properties of matter that are said to be present in every material object, every material particle. And so what's called the earth element is identified with the property of, call it resistance or extension, the property by which matter occupies space and resists the encroachment of other material particles. So, though at the level of ordinary discourse, ordinary way of speaking, we would distinguish, say, the solid table as being representing the earth element, and we would say that the tea represents the water element or the liquid element. We know that within the liquid of the tea there are particles, atoms, and if we which have nuclear, subatomic particles, and so on. So if we compress the tea, at a certain point, it will go down, 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 but at a certain point there'll be resistance. If we put enough pressure, it will solidify. And so this illustrates that even the earth element is present in a liquid. Or if we drop the temperature of water or tea in a freezer, if we put the water in the freezer, it turns into ice. So this would demonstrate that the earth element is already present in water. And then any kind of material body above absolute freezing, absolute zero, has some degree of heat. Even when we go outside in the winter, we say that the ice is really cold, the weather is really cold. But if you were to go to Siberia in the winter and then come back to New York State, you would say it's balmy and comfortable. Or even, not to speak of Siberia, in the Midwest this past winter, temperatures were down 40 degrees below zero. And here in New York State, when the temperature was 10 degrees, we were saying, oh, it's absolutely freezing, I can't go out today. But if you took a plane from Indiana or Iowa to New York and got out, put on your swimsuit and say, where is the swimming pool? 10 degrees, perfect, the perfect day for the beach. Okay, and then in matter, there's always even the cup that seems to be standing still. It seems to be hard and solid, but there's some movement of the particles. If we had this vision like an electron microscope, so that we could look at the ceramic material of the cup, really in fine detail, we would see a whole bunch of molecules running around, moving around, vibrating, in constant motion. So that constant vibration and motion, that's supposed to be illustrate the presence of the air element or wind element. And so when we could use this analysis in terms of the property of matter to attend to the body itself, in fact, this is what's done with the 4-element meditation. One way to do it is by analyzing the body into the different constituents, the way the Buddha does when he's speaking to Rahula. But another way is to focus upon the distinctive qualities of each of the material elements, so we can tune into and discern the earth element by way of the 2 properties, sort of contrasting properties of hardness and softness. So hardness is the prominence, indicates prominence of the earth element, whereas softness indicates the subordinate role of the earth element, or weakness of the earth element. So hardness and softness are both representing the earth element. Then when we attend to the body sort of meditatively in contemplation, one could get a sense of on the one hand, of the flowing of substances through the body. And also it's explained, this is in the Abhidhamma way of explanation, that the water element or liquid element has the property of cohesion, of binding together. So the water element is what functions a little bit like the atomic cement that holds the particles of the earth element together into one distinct entity. I think in subatomic physics, or nuclear physics, they speak about a subatomic particle called the gluons, which are said to be responsible for holding is it the quarks together? Or they hold the protons? Oh, gee, my science knowledge has gotten so rusty. Protons and neutrons together, hold them together in the nucleus of an atom. So maybe here we could see the gluons as sort of modern counterpart of the water element in the sense of cohesion or binding. And then one that tends to the body, focusing upon, especially upon the heat in the body, but also on the contrast between heat and coldness in the body. And so sometimes the body will feel warm, sometimes cold. And one could, as the attention becomes sharpened and mindfulness more precise, one could experience this heat and coolness through the entire body, scanning the body for the heat and cool. And then the air element can be attended to by focusing especially on the in and out breathing, not doing mindfulness of breathing. This is the element meditation. But as one is breathing in and out, one notices that as one is breathing in, one notices that the whole body tends to expand, and one could even feel the sensation of expansion down in the belly, the buttocks, even the legs and the feet. And as one breathes out, one could feel the sensation of contraction, not only in the chest, but in the belly, the buttocks, the legs, the feet. And again, as one attends even more finely, one could get the sense of constant motion of particles throughout the whole body. So in this way, one is observing the work, the operation of the air element. Then there's the space element. When the Buddha speaks to Rahula, this is on page 529, he says that the space element may be internal or external. Then the internal space element is whatever is internal, belonging to oneself, is space, spatial, and clung to. And here the space element is taken to be those parts in relation to the body, those parts of the body which are not apparently occupied by the other elements. So he says the holes of the the holes of the ears, the nostrils, the mouth, then that aperture whereby what is eaten, drunk, consumed, and tasted gets swallowed. That would be the esophagus, we call the gullet. And then where it collects, that would be the empty space of the stomach. Then where it's excreted from below, that would be the empty space in the anus. So it seems that those areas are occupied by an air element. Okay, so that's the internal space element, and then all unoccupied space externally would be the external space element. Okay, so that takes care of the 5 elements. And then in this sutta, the Discourse on Many Elements, the Buddha mentions also the consciousness element. And here the consciousness element, probably, again, though it's not analyzed in the text, but we would say that it includes all of the 6 types of consciousness mentioned in the 18 elements. All 6 types of consciousness, and probably the mind element as well. So we would say that 7 types of consciousness, the 6 types of discerning consciousness, and the mind element go into the consciousness element. Of course, that leaves the question open: what happens to feelings, perceptions, the mental formations? Any ideas? I don't have a clear answer myself, so don't hesitate to. The consciousness element, the feeling, perception, volitional activities, aggregates, where would they go in relation to the 6 elements?
They seem to processes that occur mentally.
They are, but where would we put them in relation to the...
In a mental phenomenon.
No, now we're not, we're taking the 6 elements. Okay, that's one possible answer. There's another possible answer I could think of.
Sense object.
What?
Sense object.
But here we don't have sense objects. Now we just have, don't pay attention to this board. We're thinking only in terms of 6 elements. Certainly feeling, perception, volitional activities, they're not earth, not water element, not heat element, not air element, not space element. So one answer is to see them included sort of implicitly in the consciousness element. The other answer, maybe this is my sort of guess, is that the scheme of the 6 elements doesn't have to be seen as all-inclusive. So maybe it just doesn't include those 3 aggregates, feelings, perceptions, mental formations. Maybe they're just not included within that scheme. But I like to see the 6 as being all-inclusive. So it's like when if you buy a computer, then they throw in a sort of a bundled package. They'll give you even though technically it's not part of the computer itself, but with the package, they'll give you a antivirus program. Maybe they'll throw in Microsoft Office, a simple kind of page layout program, for making simple page design. I don't know whether they do that in the US, but I remember when we used to buy computers in Sri Lanka, they would throw in, because the prices were rather extravagant, but they tell you, look what you're getting. You're getting Microsoft Office, you're getting well, those days they didn't give antivirus programs. You're getting Microsoft Office, we're giving you a sort of outdated version of, in those days, it was Aldus PageMaker and some other programs. And so you think you're getting a real bargain. Okay, so we could see feeling, perception, volitional activities, aggregates bundled along with the mental computer, the consciousness element.
Okay, would it be wrong to see feeling is not an element here? Feeling actually is the relationship between the 4 elements?
One might say it in that way. But it's just, it's not dealt with explicitly in the text. Any other questions on this? Shall we try it? Let's see. I think we could get in another group of elements. I'm going to do something rather daring and drastic right now. If you wanted to preserve this for review, I'll work my way down. Is this getting boring, by the way? I don't want to bore people. Sometimes I think it might be too. People think, oh, this early Buddhism, just so much analysis and classification. Let me go to Zen. There's a monk asked the Zen master, does the dog have a Buddha nature? And the master says, woof! And then you just, so interesting. Why does he say woof? Rather than. Are the legs the dog? Is the head the dog? The tail the dog? The stomach the dog? Does the dog have the earth element, water element, air element, fire element? Go back to Southeast Asia. Okay, so Ananda asks whether there could be another way of one is skilled in the element. And now the Buddha speaks about 6 elements: the pleasure element, the pain element, the joy element, the grief element, the equanimity element, and the ignorance element. So these are 6 elements, and when one knows and sees these 6 elements, then one is called skilled in the elements. So here we just seem to have an enumeration of 6 elements, but there's a relationship between these elements. 5 of these elements belong to the category of feeling. And so we have, can somebody read them, the list to me, so I don't have to go back and forth? The order in which they come. Pleasure first. Next. Okay. Joy.
Grief.
Okay, grief. Maybe, I'm not so sure that I like grief as a rendering anymore. Let's just call it sadness. Grief is too strong. We just call it. Of course, domanassa can include like a whole range of feelings. Grief is really the extreme of sorrow. But even if one is feeling a little off, a little upset about something, that's also included here. Then what remains is equanimity. Then the last one is not a feeling, but it's mentioned here anyways, this ignorance. Now, most often, the Buddha's texts mention these 5 together. It's very unusual. I think this might be the only place, it's the only place that I know of where ignorance is added to this list. But these 5 are 5 types of feeling. And these 5 come in certain sets. Pleasure and joy are both aspects of pleasant feeling. The difference is that pleasure is a bodily feeling. Whereas joy is a mental feeling. But I have to qualify this a bit and point out that all feeling is actually a mental factor, but pleasant feeling, if it occurs through the body, with the body as the basis. For example, on a nice warm day, I'm lying in the grass and there's a cool breeze blowing. Then the body feels pleasure. Or with a sensual caress, that's a bodily pleasant feeling. Where I lie down on a soft bed when I'm tired, then there comes a pleasant bodily feeling. So the bodily feelings, the feeling itself is a mental event, but this mental event is based on bodily sensations. Whereas what's called somanassa, joy, is called a mental feeling. This is a feeling that arises, say, if I see a friend that I haven't seen in a long time, then I'm happy. Or somebody praises me, then I feel happy. Or somebody invites me to go out for a nice meal, then I feel happy. Or I win the lottery, then my troubles start, from what I've heard from those who win lotteries. Okay, so you get the idea, the distinction here. Okay, then the same distinction applies to these two feelings. So these are both painful feelings. But what's called pain here is bodily. So I sit down and there's a thumbtack on the chair that I wasn't aware of. I get a sharp pain. Or after I'm lying out in the sun for a while, the sun gets really hot, and then the body starts to get pain from the sunburn, maybe. Or that fresh breeze brings in a downpour of rain, and then I get the unpleasant sensation of getting wet by the sudden downpour of rain. Or the weather changes, and what happens to many people, they get arthritis pains, headache, or other sensations. So all of these are bodily pains. And then the mental pain I go in for work and the boss says, I want to speak to you for a moment. And then he says, I'm sorry, but we have to downsize. You're out of here. Or some student stands up and says, you don't know what you're talking about. You're just making pretense of being learned. Then I get upset. Okay, so these are any kind of feeling of, could be sadness, disappointment, or a good friend departs, so then he maybe moves to California or to Europe, then I feel sad because separation from dear ones. So any kind of mental displeasure, mental unhappiness is domanassa. And strangely, it would seem to me, I don't want to criticize the Buddha, but it would seem that equanimity could also have been divided into two categories, and I don't know why this hasn't come down in the text. Always they just have 5 with equanimity put all together. But if we just use a little reflection, we could have had 2 kinds of equanimous, indifferent feeling, bodily and mental. So the bodily would be just, I just come into a room, it's just a very plain room, there's nothing special. So my feeling is that of equanimity based on a sense perception.
Could it be that this is why ignorance is here, because equanimity is being used, bodily sensation
I'm not so sure, because elsewhere, as I said, we find just the 5 kinds of feelings. So still, in the other passages, if ignorance was not there, the question would still come up, why is an equanimity divided into 2 kinds?
I mean, the whole set, everything is
Yeah.
6s.
Oh, maybe that's the reason.
See that they threw in ignorance in order to have something equivalent to equanimity that's mental.
But not everything is 6s. We have 18, we have then 6, then we have a 6, then we have a 6, then a 3. Of course, you could say that everything is a multiple of 3s. I don't know, actually. But in any case, it seems on reflection that one could divide equanimity into 2 kinds, that which is related to the body. I think I know why, but it gets a bit technical. Okay, but let's just say, okay, or I'm walking through and there's just this ordinary sound, I'm walking down the street, the ordinary sound of just traffic, no screeching of tires or honking of horns, but just occasional cars going by, the sound of people maybe as they pass them chatting. So there's no particular happiness or sorrow or sadness on my part because of those perceptions.
After the 18s, then all the 6s, then 3, then 4, then 2. Is it possible that that the scheme is being drawn from the number series? There are 2 of these, 4 of those, all of that.
Yeah, I mean, some of them,
with the,
yeah.
with the number series.
I mean, definitely the usual sets are drawn from familiar number sets. The 18 elements, 6 elements, then below we'll come across the 12 sense bases. So those are familiar sets. This one, the only thing I could think of, as you said, is that maybe ignorance was added in order to have another neat 6-fold set. But normally we have these 5 types of feeling occurring separately. Particularly we find them in Sutta Nikaya, in the chapter on faculties. That's chapter 48 of the Sutta Nikaya. That's the chapter on faculties. So these are called 5 faculties of feeling. And then ignorance is added here, and the reason why, according to the commentary, why ignorance is put in here, it said that ignorance is similar to equanimity or a counterpart of equanimity. And there's some little statement in another sutta which throws some light on this. This would be sutta number 44. On page 403, this is a dialogue between the nun, a bhikkhuni named Dhammadina, and a layman whose name is Visakha. So Visakha asks Dhammadina, what is the counterpart of pleasant feeling? And she says, painful feeling is the counterpart, or in this case, the opposite of pleasant feeling. Then what is the counterpart of painful feeling? Then the answer is pleasant feeling. So those 2 are direct opposites. But then he asks, what is the counterpart of neither painful nor pleasant feeling? Now, neither painful nor pleasant feeling is another term for equanimous feeling. And then she says, ignorance is the counterpart of neither painful nor pleasant feeling.